We'll shoot first and argue afterwards. William Halsey had an enormous head. His caps were size 7 7/8, specially made, and his expressions, both his sunny smile and fierce scowl, were outsized. He looked like the figurehead of Neptune, according to the 1904 Naval Academy yearbook, The Lucky Bag, which also described him, at age 21, as a real old salt. Halsey could be theatrical and loved to play the role of sailorman, a favourite term, but he had long since become the actor he played. He was never seasick. He was much happier standing on the bridge of a ship than sitting behind a desk, and when he used nautical lingo, the back seat of his limousine was the stern sheets he was not putting on airs. He spent most of his career at sea, more than 2 decades aboard swift but wet destroyers before graduating to higher commands. Unlike many sailors, he was not profane, but like many sailors, he was superstitious. He filled his pockets with odd trinkets, feared Friday the 13th, and refused to fly in the same airplane as his boss, Admiral Chester Nimitz. "That's not superstitious," he explained. "It's common sense. Chester is bad Joss in the air. He was a squared-away naval officer, his buttons always brightly polished, his shoes shined. He seemed to spend hours in the bathroom in the morning, tending to his ablutions. But he was not otherwise fussy or a stickler. He was informal with his officers, who reverently referred to him as Admiral Bill, and he abolished neckties on the uniforms of naval officers in the tropical South Pacific. He loved parties and staying up all night carousing. There are exceptions, of course, but as the general rule, he proclaimed, "I never trust a sailorman who doesn't smoke or drink." He cried easily. When he received letters, as many senior combat officers did during World War II, from aggrieved families or ordinary citizens accusing him of wasting the lives of young American men, he would mope for days. Halsey was a bit of a myth-maker, but he was not a phony, and he regretted some of the myths he had himself created. No one except General MacArthur, an even larger mythical invention, directly addressed him as Bull, a nickname Halsey insisted that newspapermen had made up. "I don't want to be remembered as Bull Halsey, who was going to ride the Emperor's white horse." He began his memoirs, published in 1947. But after the war, he had posed astride a white horse, and his ghost-written memoirs contain, in at least a few demonstrable places, the kind of slight elaborations that helped create the myth. Halsey was a deceptive figure rendered larger than life, at times almost buffoonish, by hero worship that verged on caricature. But he was also a sensitive man, and smarter than he sometimes appeared to be. He could, and often did, sound like a hater, but he was more often good-hearted than bitter. His reaction and action on the first day of war illustrate some of his best and worst qualities. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, Halsey arose before 6 a.m. 600 hours to watch the launch of 18 planes from his aircraft carrier, the Enterprise. They were bound for Ford Island, the Navy airstrip in the middle of Pearl Harbor. Halsey had expected to enter the channel at Pearl Harbor at 7:30 a.m., but strong headwinds had delayed the refueling of his destroyers. Halsey's small task force, returning to Pearl after delivering some planes to the Marine outpost on Wake Island in the Central Pacific, was running behind schedule. They were still 150 miles away from Hawaii. On a war footing, Halsey sent up a dawn search ahead of his fleet, with orders that the planes were to fly on ahead to Pearl, although without first notifying anyone at Pearl that the planes were coming. After launching the planes, Halsey returned to his cabin, shaved, bathed, and put on a clean uniform, he recalled. It was now a minute or two after 8. The phone rang, and Halsey's flag secretary, Lieutenant Douglas Moulton, took the call. After exclaiming, "What?" he put down the phone and turned, with a look of shock of his face. The Japanese were attacking Pearl Harbor, he said. Halsey's first instinct was that it was all a big mistake, that jumpy defenders at Pearl had mistaken the unannounced arrival of Halsey's planes as Japanese attackers. In the first draft of his memoirs, essentially a dictated oral history, Halsey recalled, "I jumped to my feet and said, 'My God, they're shooting at our planes.'" In his published memoir, Ghosted by Commander Joseph Bryan White H., Halsey exclaims, "My God, they're shooting at my own boys." Halsey may have thought of his boys, but Doug Moulton later told his family that what Halsey actually said was, "That joke's in lousy taste." A moment later, Commander Harold Ham Dow, Halsey's communications officer, burst in with a dispatch, "From Sinkpak, Ep.2, all ships present air raid on Pearl Harbor. X. This is no drill. Despite his momentary disbelief, Halsey had been expecting war. When the Enterprise had sorted from Pearl for Wake Island on November 28th, he had asked the captain of the Enterprise to issue Battle Order Number 1, which began, "The Enterprise is now operating under war conditions, and at any time, day or night, we must be ready for instant action." Halsey's operations officer, Commander William Burraker, protested, "God damn it, Admiral, you can't start a private war of your own. Who's going to take responsibility?" Halsey recalled that he answered, "I'll take it. If anyone gets in my way, we'll shoot first and argue afterwards." Halsey had been focusing on the threat from Japanese submarines. Even he did not expect a Japanese carrier task force to attack Pearl Harbor, but it had, and Halsey was determined to find the Japanese fleet. Somewhere off the coast of Hawaii, possibly close by Halsey's ship at this very moment, were a half-dozen Japanese carriers. Providential headwinds had saved the Enterprise from destruction by the Japanese planes, which had hit Pearl Harbor shortly after 7:50 a.m., just when Halsey had been expected to drop anchor in the crowded harbor. Nelson's adage, "No captain can go wrong who places his ship alongside an enemy's," had been burned in my brain, Halsey related in his memoirs. But where were the enemy's ships? Halsey was proudly, defiantly, offence-minded. He was also fond of invoking Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest, whose simple rule of operation was, "Get there first with the most men." But Halsey, who lacked Forrest's conciseness, distorted General Forrest's words in a small but revealing way. "I think General Forrest's description is the best thing I know, to get to the other fellow with everything you have and as fast as you can and to dump it on him," Halsey said in December to a commission investigating the Pearl Harbor attack. Halsey had missed a subtle but important distinction. When Forrest said, "Get there first with the most men," he meant get there with more men than the enemy had. In Halsey's sometimes imprecise mind, this became get to the other fellow with everything you have. Everything in this case meant 1 aircraft carrier, 3 cruisers, and 9 destroyers. The Japanese First Fleet had 6 carriers and multiple battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. If Halsey had found Admiral Nagumo's striking force that day, Halsey's task force would have more than likely been annihilated. America had only 3 aircraft carriers in the Pacific at the time, the Enterprise and the Lexington, sailing out of Pearl Harbor, and the Saratoga, docked in San Diego. For the United States, it was a blessing of strategic magnitude that all 3 carriers survived the opening days of the war. At the time, Halsey does not appear to have considered what might have happened if he had found the Japanese. He would later write, "I have the consolation of knowing that on the opening day of the war, I did everything in my power to find a fight." That day, and in the jittery days that followed as Halsey searched for the Japanese fleet after a brief stop in Pearl Harbor, Halsey's men thought they saw the Japanese lurking behind every wave. Whales became submarines, dolphins became torpedoes, floating broom handles became periscopes, scores of depth charges were expended to kill fish. Halsey, increasingly frustrated, recorded his exasperation when a young officer aboard the Enterprise, watching the destroyer Benham run down a supposed submarine contact, cried out, "Look! She's sinking! There she goes!" Halsey snatched up his binoculars and looked out. The Benham was hull down, momentarily obscured as she dipped into the trough of a wave. The destroyer arose again on the crest of the next swell. Halsey turned on the young lieutenant. "If you ever make another report like that, I'll have you thrown over the side." Halsey was gritting his teeth when the Enterprise sailed into Pearl Harbor at dusk on December 8th. His attention was immediately drawn to the wreck of the battleship Utah in the mooring space that would have been occupied by the Enterprise, had she not been delayed returning to Pearl. A pall of oily black smoke still hung over the harbor, and the silent, gaping sailors who lined the deck of the Enterprise recoiled when someone recognized the acrid, still unfamiliar stench seeping across the water burned human flesh. The Enterprise passed close by the battleship Nevada, beached in the channel as she tried to make a run for it during the attack. The once mighty battleship Oklahoma had rolled over, exposing her raw red bottom. The battleship Arizona, what was left of her, still burned. An exhausted soldier manning an anti-aircraft gun along the shore yelled out, "Where the hell were you?" Halsey growled. "Before we're through with them, the Japanese language will be spoken only in hell. It was the first and most colourful of his many avowals to kill as many Japanese as possible. As darkness fell, the night was lit by streams of machine gun bullets, fired by strung-out anti-aircraft gunners shooting wildly at anything they could imagine. Halsey was greeted on shore by a ghostly sight, Adm. Husband Kimmel, the commander of the Pacific Fleet, still in his Sunday morning dress whites, now streaked with ash and mud. A large, smoky blotch defaced the front of his uniform. A spent machine gun bullet had crashed through Kimmel's window as he was watching the attack and struck him in the chest. Picking up the bullet, Kimmel had murmured, "It would have been more merciful if it had killed me." Halsey knew that Kimmel's career was over, and he felt for him. Kimmel was a friend in the tight, tiny world of Annapolis men that ran the pre-war Navy. He had been an usher in Halsey's wedding, but Halsey was irked by the beaten fearfulness of Kimmel and his staff. When a report came in that Japanese gliders bearing assault troops were landing nearby, Halsey laughed out loud. Kimmel wheeled on him and angrily demanded, "What in the hell are you laughing at?" Halsey explained that he had heard many damn fool reports in his life, but this was the damnedest fool report yet. The Japanese could not have towed gliders thousands of miles from their home islands, and they weren't about to waste their carrier decks on gliders. Kimmel smiled sheepishly. "You were right," he said. Halsey was determined to present an unyielding, fierce, vengeful facade. Sensing that his own aviators were feeling a little skittish, he addressed them in their wardroom on the Enterprise on the morning of December 10th. The war diary of the Air Group Fighting 6 does not record exactly what Halsey said, but it conveys the general impression he made on the pilots. "Those Japanese had better look out for that man," it says. Thus was a legend born that would grow until Halsey could not recognize himself, though he could not refrain from embellishing the myth. Most of his ancestors, he wrote in his 1947 memoir, were seafarers and adventurers, big, violent men, impatient of the law, and prone to strong drink and strong language. Many of his forebears did go to sea, and one was even a pirate, Captain Jack Halsey, an early 18th century privateer whose exploits are described in the history of the lives and bloody exploits of the most noted patriots. But the rest appear to have lived ordinary middle-class lives. Halsey's paternal grandfather was an Episcopal priest who died when he fell out of a rectory window while experiencing a dizzy spell. Enticed by reading some true-life sea adventure stories, Halsey's father had attended the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis, Maryland, and made a moderately successful career in the Navy. Young William wanted to go to Annapolis as well, but never a scholar. He failed to get an appointment on his first try and wound up at the University of Virginia. Though Halsey spent only a year in Charlottesville, the impression made on him was lasting. Mr. Jefferson's University was a genteel place at the end of the 19th century, and Halsey, a natural charmer, was swept into the most aristocratic of the fraternities, St. Anthony Hall. There he developed a taste for whiskey and a romantic identification with the Virginia Cavalier, the beau ideal of the dashing gentleman soldier. He also absorbed a tinge of racial bigotry that undercut his generally open-minded and warm-hearted nature. Halsey would cherish his fraternity brothers, though when a place opened up at the Naval Academy after his first year in college, he jumped at it. The academy on the banks of the Severn had been a sleepy, backward-looking place for most of its 19th century existence, imbuing naval officers with a sense of Southern chivalry. Annapolis was beginning to break out of its torpor when Halsey arrived in June 1900. The impetus was the American Navy's crushing defeat of 2 Spanish fleets in sea battles halfway around the world from each other, at Santiago Bay, Cuba, and Manila Bay in the Philippines in 1898. The New World was pushing aside the old imperialists. A new order was arising, a kind of benign, less exploitive colonialism, though 3,000 American soldiers died suppressing a Filipino insurrection. The politicians and the jingoist press extolled the westward expansion into the Pacific. America was fulfilling its manifest destiny, and the U.S. Navy would lead the way. Every captain aboard the American warships in the Spanish-American War had been an Annapolis man. Suddenly the Navy was all the popular rage. Annapolis attained instant mystique. To replace shabby, crumbling dormitories, Congress ordered the construction of a magnificent white marble and brick Beaux Arts campus. Midshipmen were to live and study in a shrine to naval glory. They were to absorb the myths of heroes past by memorizing sayings and lore and worshipping ancient relics, the tattered ensigns and iron cannon of battles won and lost. For a young midshipman with a sense of romance and history, the mix of old salt and almost overnight old grandeur was thrilling. Work commenced on the massive new main building, Bancroft Hall, in 1901, as Halsey was beginning his second year. Annapolis men were hazed, though not nearly as cruelly as their Japanese counterparts at Etajima. Upper-classmen were forbidden from touching plebes' first-year students. If they violated this injunction, the plebe was free to hit back, an important cultural distinction from Japan, where the plebes were required to suffer blows in obedient silence. There was a certain amount of book learning at Annapolis, especially in engineering, but English was known as bull, and intellectualism was not the point. Midshipmen were adjured not to appear unduly bright, according to an academy history. Annapolis was about building character, which was fine by Halsey, who had low grades and told his father he'd rather bilge flunk out than quit football. Halsey graduated in the lower third of his class, but he was a great success at Annapolis, everybody's friend, according to the 1904 lucky bag. Halsey and his classmates would remember their Annapolis days as demanding but euphoric. They felt they were joining a brotherhood for life, and they were not wrong. During Halsey's day, the President of the United States was a familiar figure on the grounds of the Academy, bustling about in his frock coat. Theodore Roosevelt, a fervent disciple of Admiral Mahan, and himself the author of a naval history about the War of 1812, wanted to build a great navy and send it around the world. When the Great White Fleet arrived in Tokyo Bay in the fall of 1908, Ensign Bill Willey and Pudge to his classmates Halsey was a junior officer aboard the battleship Kansas. Halsey, whose notions of Anglo-Saxon superiority were ingrained and never hidden, seems to have taken an instant dislike to the Japanese. He was not impressed by the great Admiral Togo, hero of Tsushima, who greeted the American officers aboard his flagship, the Mikasa. He regarded Togo as tricky and deceitful for having staged surprise torpedo attacks on Chinese and Russian ships. Halsey and his mates were permitted to give Togo a toss to follow the example of Japanese sailors tossing and catching their officers with a blanket to cries of banzai. Since Togo was a shrimp, Halsey recounted in his memoir, "We gave him 3 real heaves. If we had known what the future held, we wouldn't have caught him after the 3rd one." Though he arrived in England too late for combat in World War I, Halsey sought out the more dangerous billets. He was a destroyer man for much of his career, commanding low, sleek, torpedo-firing destroyers. He liked the cockiness and dash of the men who sailed the smaller, faster ships, more vulnerable than battleships, but more gallant too. You could tell a destroyer man by the way he cocked his cap and walked down the street, recalled Halsey in his memoir. But by the early 1930s, he was far-sighted enough to see that the Navy's future lay with air power. Slated to command an aircraft carrier, he was bold or reckless, enough to earn his wings at the age of 52. He was a dangerously bad flyer. Refusing to wear his glasses, he could not read the instruments, and thus he often had no idea where he was flying, or how fast or how high. But he was always well liked by his men. For all his bluster, Halsey had a genuine self-deprecating streak. As an ensign, he had learned to get along well with enlisted men while patrolling whorehouses in foreign ports. He did not hold himself aloof. He mixed with the sailors and apparently their consorts. There was much sniggering over Halsey's nickname Big Bill. In flight school at Pensacola, when Halsey cracked up his plane by ploughing into a landing light on the runway, he was awarded a decoration called the Flying Jackass, an aluminum breastplate shaped like a donkey. Winners were required to wear the jackass until another neophyte pilot came along to do something stupid enough to win it away. Halsey, who held the rank of captain and was twice the age of the pilot cadets, dutifully wore his jackass. When the time came to relinquish the decoration, he refused. He said he wanted to post it in his cabin aboard the Saratoga, the aircraft carrier he was slated to command, as a reminder of humility. "If anybody aboard does anything stupid, he'll take a look at the jackass before I bawl him out, and I'll say, 'Wait a minute, Bill Halsey, you're not so damn good yourself.'" Admiral Nimitz, Halsey's new boss as the chief of the Pacific Fleet replacing the disgraced Kimmel, was not Halsey's type. In contrast to the garrulous, boozing Halsey, Nimitz was a model of Germanic self-control. During the weeks and months after Pearl Harbor, Nimitz rarely, if ever, smiled. His lips were compressed into a thin, straight line. His eyes did not flash like Halsey's, but rather peered quizzically. A year behind the irrepressible Halsey at Annapolis, Nimitz had graduated in the top 10th of his class. Calm and steady-going, judged the lucky bag. But Nimitz believed in delegating and not second-guessing his line officers, and he needed Halsey. He needed a hero to show the public and his own bosses back in Washington that he was fighting back. The newspapers were crying, "Where is the Navy? Why hasn't the Navy fought back?" The public had been panicked by the Japanese sneak attack at Pearl Harbor. For many months, Americans had sensed that war was coming, but not right away, and they had focused more on Europe, where Hitler had been rampaging for the past 3 years. Many not just died in the wool isolationists, but ordinary citizens from around the country wanted to avoid a world war, if at all possible. At the movies, before the double feature, they had seen newsreels of Japan's brutalization of China and its encroachment into Southeast Asia. Some were at least vaguely aware of the rape of Nanking and other atrocities, but a lingering and unreasoning sense of racial superiority blinkered many Americans to Japan's military threat. Somehow, the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere sounded like a joke, while the Emperor even well-educated Americans were led to believe was a silly little man with a taste for jazz, Scotch, and marine biology. Pearl Harbor had been a terrible awakening. Overnight, the Japanese were transformed in the public eye from midgets to monsters. Angry crowds roamed the streets in Los Angeles, chasing the occasional Japanese immigrant who dared venture out, and better-off people began firing their Japanese gardeners and kitchen help and accusing them of spying. At the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, someone chopped down the cherry trees that had been planted as a gift from the Japanese people. But amid the hysteria and rumors of imminent invasion, a grim purposefulness quickly emerged. There were long lines outside recruiting centers all over the United States before dawn on December 8th, and in Honolulu, where the oily smoke lay heavy over the palm trees, even prostitutes were volunteering to roll bandages. Isolationism vanished without a trace. A vast polyglot nation went to war, virtually as one. Victory gardens were planted. Victory bonds were sold. Victory girls worked the train stations where the boys in their new khaki uniforms went to war or passed through on the way to military bases that were sprouting up overnight. Bankers' sons, farmers' boys, immigrants who could barely speak English signed up with Uncle Sam, a vast army of citizen soldiers, untrained but willing. The military was not ready for them. For the first few months after Pearl Harbor, until the production lines began to churn in earnest, the new recruits trained by throwing eggs as grenades and wielding broomsticks as rifles. The peacetime military had been underappreciated and underfunded, ingrown and mediocre. Caught by surprise, the Navy brass was demoralized, even defeatist. Annapolis men blamed the politicians and hunkered down for the inevitable blame game. Halsey was a dazzling exception. He was, Admiral Nimitz appreciated, the answer to his problems, a bracing, effervescent cocktail of a man at a hand-wringing ladies' temperance meeting. Nimitz had been sent to Hawaii to restore shattered morale and bring some fighting spirit. His official title in Navy bureaucratese was CYNCPAC, Commander-in-Chief Pacific. His boss in Washington, Admiral Ernest King, was Cominch, or simply Commander-in-Chief, a title shortened right after Pearl Harbor from its unfortunate predecessor, Cincus, pronounced Cincus. Beneath Nimitz's steady-as-she-goes demeanor, he was fighting off his own sense of shock and demoralization. When he was given his appointment, his wife had congratulated him on getting the fleet. Nimitz had responded, "The fleet, dear, is at the bottom of the ocean." But the carriers were still afloat, and Nimitz needed to show the Japanese and the American people that the Navy could still fight. Nimitz needed an aggressive fleet commander. The newly minted Cinque-Pac wanted to stage carrier raids on Japanese outposts in the Marshall and Gilbert Islands, coral specks in the mid-Pacific, to show that the Navy had not taken Pearl Harbor lying down. Most of Nimitz's staff, largely inherited from Kimmel and still badly shaken by December 7th, heatedly opposed Nimitz's idea as too dangerous. The fleet was not ready yet, they argued at a Cinque-Pac conference in early January 1942. To commit the carriers was to risk losing all that was left. Halsey, back at Pearl after more fruitless searching for the Japanese at sea, came storming into the meeting and raised hell. The admirals were being defeatist, he charged. Yes, there were always risks in staging offensive operations, but to do nothing was unacceptable. Halsey's precise words were not recorded, but they carried the day, and they left a profound impression on Admiral Nimitz. In later years, when Halsey's critics demanded his head, Nimitz would remember how Halsey had stood up for him in those critical early days. The Enterprise and another carrier, the Yorktown, sent around from the Atlantic to bolster the shattered Pacific Fleet, struck Japanese bases in the Marshalls and Gilberts in early February. Halsey was so nervous on the eve of battle that he repaired to his sea cabin so his men would not sense his anxiety. He smoked and read trashy novels and lay awake. In the morning, he listened on earphones as his pilots shouted out their successes at Kwajalein Harbour in cocky American slang. "Get away from that cruiser, Jack. She's mine. And bingo. And look at that big bastard burn." The pilots claimed to have sunk 16 Japanese ships, including a cruiser, 2 subs, and even a small carrier. Halsey believed them, and he repeated their claims in his memoir. Their actual score was 1 transport and 2 smaller vessels sunk. It was not the only time Halsey was fooled by the boasts of his pilots. Halsey came under enemy fire for the first time in his life off of Watya Island in the Marshalls on February 1st. Violating established doctrine by making his carrier vulnerable to shore-based bombers, he had brought the Enterprise in so close to the island that he could see anti-aircraft fire bursting around his planes as they bombed and strafed Japanese shore positions. 5 twin-engined Japanese bombers dived on the American carrier. Their bombs narrowly missed, but a wounded Betty, its engines on fire, turned and dove right into the Enterprise. The plane seemed to be aiming for the planes parked on the carrier deck, but clipped a wing and plunged into the sea, setting off a small fire that was easily contained. It was Halsey's first close experience with the Japanese warrior spirit. It did not intimidate him. Rather, he determined to be dismissive, to regard Japan's suicidal sacrifices as self-defeating, more pathetic than noble. As Halsey later explained in a letter, the Americans fought to live, the Japanese fought to die. On February 5th, the Enterprise entered Pearl Harbor, flying her huge battle ensign, to an entirely changed mood. The ships in the harbor blew their sirens, and soldiers and patients from the Hickam Field Hospital lined the shore to cheer themselves hoarse. On the bridge of the Big E, Halsey choked up. "I myself cried and was not ashamed," he recalled. Nimitz came charging aboard, smiling now, exclaiming, "Nice going!" One of Nimitz's deputies, a doubter before, was excitedly wagging a finger in Halsey's face. "Damn you, Bill, you had no business getting home from that one. No business at all." Back in the States, the newspapers, believing the pilots' wildly inflated claims of damage to the Japanese fleet, proclaimed, "Pearl Harbor avenged." Americans had been desperate for good news. Although most Americans believed instinctively, as a matter of faith, that the United States would ultimately prevail, the headlines in the winter of 1942 were discouraging. The global war was not going well for the Allies. Hitler's armies were still on the march, deep in Russia at the gates of Moscow and in North Africa driving towards Suez. Japan seemed to be running wild through the Pacific and Southeast Asia. With a straight face, Americans described Japanese soldiers swinging from the trees as they marched through the supposedly impenetrable jungle of the Malay Peninsula to attack the British Crown colony of Singapore. The British, having deemed such an advance impossible, had built most of Singapore's fortifications facing out to sea. The British garrison at Singapore, over 100,000 men, was on the verge of surrendering to a smaller but far more aggressive Japanese army surging down from the north. The southern movement, as the Japanese called their rapid conquest of Malaya and Indonesia, was moving ominously close to Australia. America's only outpost in Asia, its quasi-colony in the Philippine Islands, was close to being overrun. On the Bataan Peninsula and its rocky outcropping, Corregidor, some 50 miles across the bay from Manila, an army of 80,000 men, 20,000 American, 60,000 Filipino under General Douglas MacArthur had been encircled and trapped. MacArthur's paralysis in the hours after Pearl Harbor remains a mystery. He was not the first great commander to freeze. Even the legendary Confederate generals Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee, so admired by romanticists like MacArthur and Halsey, had been overcome by a strange ennui at critical moments. But MacArthur's days, as one of his biographers, William Manchester, describes it, was catastrophic. Some 9 hours after the attack at Pearl Harbor, Japanese bombers found MacArthur's air force mostly on the ground and destroyed it. In late December, a Japanese force invaded and began driving MacArthur's army into its final redoubt. An earlier plan to defend the beaches was abandoned, along with tons of supplies. Retreating onto the Bataan Peninsula, blowing bridges as they went, MacArthur's men were forced to leave behind the bulk of their food. MacArthur was slow to appreciate what he was up against. The Japanese commander, General Masaharu Homma, was an interesting example of Japanese ambivalence and ferocity. An Anglophile and Americanophile who had opposed the war, he was an amateur playwright. After the war, he would be executed by the Allies for war crimes. When MacArthur first saw the Japanese Air Force in action, he assumed the pilots could only be white mercenaries. MacArthur's own obsolete forces included one of history's last horse cavalry regiments, whose mounted troopers were strafed by those mysteriously able pilots in their surprisingly nimble and deadly Zero fighters. The Americans, stranded and surrounded on the Bataan Peninsula and bombarded in their rocky caves on Corregidor, allowed themselves to believe for a while in a dramatic rescue mission by the American Navy. None was forthcoming. In his diary, Secretary of War Henry Stimson wrote, "There are times when brave men have to die." General MacArthur himself possessed some Bushido spirit, and he resolved to die honorably, along with his wife and young child. Against a backdrop of such strategic and human disaster, Halsey's raids against the Marshall Islands in the winter of 1942 did not amount to much. Even Halsey recognized that they were essentially pinpricks. But the American raids had a tremendous impact on the Chief of Staff of the Japanese Combined Fleet. On February 1, 1942, Admiral Ugaki wrote in his diary, "Rain, later cloudy." Before 7, a report came in of an air raid on the Marshalls. "They have come after all. They are some guys." Ugaki was not being facetious. He respected the Americans for their daring and defiance in sending carriers close in to a Japanese airbase. Japanese forces had been running freely through Indonesia and Southeast Asia. Now they would have to watch their flank. "It seems we have been somewhat fooled," wrote Ugaki. "The incident was really a reproach that went to the heart. We must admit that this is the best way to make us look ridiculous. Adventure is one of their characteristics, and the most probable move they would make would be an air raid on our capital." Ugaki was learning to appreciate the true nature of his enemy. A common cliché in Japan at the time was that the fearful, spoiled women of America would not let their husbands fight. But Admiral Yamamoto's warnings about American resourcefulness were beginning to undermine Ugaki's smug sense of racial superiority and his disdain for weak American men and their frightened wives. Ugaki's views on racial purity would have been shaken further if he had known that an American warrior he would one day face in battle was a mixed-blood Cherokee Indian named Ernest Evans. If homogeneity was Japan's strength, one race with one purpose under the hand of a divine emperor, then heterogeneity was America's. Compared to Japan, America was a wide-open society, but for a dark-skinned boy to get ahead took great resourcefulness and stubbornness, qualities that could be useful on a battlefield. The story of how Evans advanced from a railroad shack in Oklahoma to the bridge of a destroyer is testimony to the virtues of social mobility and strength of character. The United States Navy in the years before World War H. Bill Halsey's Navy was reflexively racist, and, at the senior level, insular and snobbish. The Naval Academy, which supplied every captain of every ship in the Navy, was supposed to produce gentlemen, which by and large meant white Protestant ones. Blacks could only sail on Navy ships as stewards serving officers in the wardroom, but there was room for a few ambitious young men of different or mixed races. After the Indian Wars of the 19th century, some commanders admired Indians for their martial spirit. Teddy Roosevelt, for one, reminisced that when he was looking for fighters for his Rough Riders in the Spanish-American War, he especially sought out Cherokees. The occasional American Indian at Annapolis was subjected to ridicule and scorn, but then so were all plebes. The survivors brought cultural virtues that no military academy could teach. Appointments to Annapolis in those days were generally made by Congress, but every year a few outstanding sailors were selected from the fleet for officer training. Ernest Evans was a poor Indian boy who had grown up in rural Oklahoma and joined the National Guard in 1926 after graduating from high school. He had quickly transferred from the Guard to the Navy and immediately applied, as an enlisted man, to the Naval Academy. Applicants were given an aptitude test. The multiple-choice test asked students mathematical questions and proper word associations. Out of 50 questions, Evans made only 2 mistakes, both revealing. Question number 15 asked, "A meal always involves a table, dishes, hunger, food, and water." The correct answer was food. Evans, whose answer was perhaps shaped by personal experience, chose hunger. Question number 23 asked, "A contest always has umpires, opponents, spectators, applause, victory." The correct answer was opponents. Evans, a born warrior, put down victory. In the 1926 yearbook of Muskogee, Oklahoma Central High School, Ernest Evans peers out of a senior photo, a proud, dark-skinned face in a sea of white classmates. His school activities were the usual ones: Scout staff, Latin club, senior pin and ring committee. There may have been other students in the class of 26 at Muskogee High with some Indian blood, but Ernest Evans was the only graduating senior who looked like a Native American. Cavans's singular status may seem surprising in a yearbook called The Chieftain, published by a public high school in the middle of historic Indian territory. The town of Muskogee had for many years called itself the capital of the 5 civilized tribes Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole. It was the seat of a huge Native American domain that had, in the years just before Evans was born in 1908, cherished dreams of American statehood. Cherokee leaders had wanted to name the nascent state Sequoia, after the tribe's great early 19th century chieftain. The Cherokees had once prized a highly developed culture with its own language and printing presses, but recent decades had been trying. Driven west from their native lands east of the Mississippi along the Trail of Tears, the Cherokee nation had eventually settled in the vast grassy plains north of Texas. The land rushes of the late 1880s and early 1890s brought white settlers streaming in. Then, at the turn of the century, oil had been discovered. By 1907, Indian Territory had be of Oklahoma. Muskogee became a boom town with a golf course, and Shingles come a state, the white-controlled state, hung for nearly 200 lawyers, the most lawyers per capita, the locals joked, outside of southern Manhattan. The lawyers were kept busy liberating Indians from their land. In return for ceding their communally held tribal lands, the Native Americans had been given small individual property allotments, from which they were quickly parted by legal sleight of hand and outright swindle. By the 1920s, the local Indians had lost 90% of their land titles. They were driven out of town or into shacks along the railroad tracks, the locale of Evans's boyhood home. In Muskogee, the few remaining Indian children went to the vocational manual training high school, not the all-white or nearly all-white Central High. Evans lifted himself up. To do so, he had to break out of a vicious spiral of downward mobility. His paternal grandfather, George Washington Evans, who was mostly white, though with a dash of Creek blood, had exploited the local Native Americans. Evans was a Southerner who had arrived in Indian Territory in 1887. He went into real estate and prospered, becoming the mayor of Ocmulgee, a small town on the railroad line with a single telegraph wire and high hopes of cashing in on the land boom. On the day Oklahoma became the Union's 46th state, G.W. Evans was exultant. According to the local newspaper, he handed out cigars and drew a crowd around his brand-new car, the only one in town. It was not uncommon in those days for white men to marry Indian women for the land allotments and then divorce them. Under the property laws of the time, the ex-husband kept title to the land. George Washington Evans divorced his first 2 wives, both Creek Indians, and disinherited his children. One of them, more Creek Indian in appearance than white, was William Charles Evans. William Evans, an unemployed carpenter, moved to the wrong side of the tracks of Muskogee and married a Cherokee woman, Anna Birdsong. On August 24, 1908, they had a son, Ernest Edwin Evans. He was born into a world of low prospects and ill will. There were bad feelings between the Creeks. who often intermarried with blacks, and the Cherokees, who looked down on blacks and had once owned slaves. Whites generally looked down on all Indians. With his mixed blood and noticeably dark skin, young Ernest Evans was caught somewhere in the middle. Possibly at his mother's insistence, he chose to be identified as a Cherokee. Cherokees weren't discriminated against, observed Marion Hagerstrand, a Cherokee scholar who had grown up in Muskogee in the 1930s, a decade after Evans. Cherokees discriminated against everyone else. Anti-Indian bigotry was, relatively speaking, subtle in those days in Muskogee. There were no signs on stores saying Indians and dogs stay out, as there were in some places up north, but an Indian boy entering a store might be followed by a clerk, just checking to make sure he didn't steal anything. A local laundry could advertise, as one did in the 1926 Central High Yearbook, that we wash for white people only, and few people, if any, would object. The Muskogee schools were de facto segregated, but the occasional Indian boy could go to Central, especially if he was good at football or track. Ernest Evans was not much of an athlete, but he did well in academics and activities, and he was serious and purposeful. In the yearbook, the inscription beneath his name, the courage of his convictions hints that he was independent-minded, if not stubborn or rebellious. He was certainly self-reliant. Though proud, the civilized Cherokees learned to keep a low profile in white society. "The nail that stands up gets hammered down," was a Cherokee saying of the time. But young Indian boys of the 5 civilized tribes identified with renegades, said Edwin Moore, a Creek who grew up near Muskogee in the 1920s. Their heroes were the Great Plains Indian chieftains Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, and closer to home, Crazy Snake, who wouldn't take white money for his land and whose insurrection had to be suppressed by the National Guard in 1904. If a boy had any spine, said Moore, a World War II veteran, he wanted to be a warrior. Despite their shabby treatment by the government, American Indians were intensely patriotic. Military service allowed Indians to win back their self-respect as warriors. In 1942, a year into World War H, U.S. Army officials stated that if the entire population enlisted in the same proportion as Indians, there would be no need for a draft. After graduating from Central High in 1926, Evans enlisted in the Oklahoma National Guard. Within a year, he was a midshipman at Annapolis, a remarkable progression for someone without any political connections. The Naval Academy in the summer of 1927 must have seemed like an otherworldly, enchanted place to a Native American boy from the hills of Oklahoma. Shimmering in the Chesapeake heat, cool and ghostly at night, the white marble of the Beaux-Arts design radiated grandeur, tradition, pride. In the chapel, a new Tiffany-stained glass window had been installed, showing a midshipman, Christ-like, in dress whites before a heavenly sea. The artist's model, Thomas J. Hamilton, 27, had kicked the extra point to preserve Navy's undefeated season against Army the year before. The academy was a temple to character and sportsmanship. Constructed in Evans's time were a boathouse for the rowers and steel stands for the football field. The source of that steel for the Thompson Field stands was a clue, however, that traditions were not quite as solid at the Naval Academy as they seemed. The steel came from battleships that had been dismantled under an arms control treaty designed to stabilize fleet building between the great powers at a 5-to-5 Britain to 3 Japan ratio. This was the naval treaty Japan secretly broke to build the Yamato. Fewer warships meant less need for line naval officers, and beginning in the 1920s, some midshipmen were being quietly advised not to accept their commissions upon graduation. 2 years after Evans graduated, half the class was denied naval commissions and graduated as civilians. The anchors aweigh, full speed-ahead spirit of Bill Halsey's day at Annapolis had given way to anxiety about the Navy's future. The Depression forced the Academy to fire 15% of its staff. Evans seemed unfazed by hard times, however, perhaps because he was still on the way up. Though he graduated fairly low in his class, 322 of 441, his yearbook epigraph was never gripes, always ambitious. The chief was described as radical from birth, an allusion to his politics, possibly, though his just getting to the Naval Academy was radical enough. At the same time, he appears to have adopted a high manner. His philosophy was life is what one makes it, according to his biographical entry in The Lucky Bag, which recorded that Evans preferred reading over studying, was big-hearted, and enjoyed a joke. He was good company, he enjoyed life, recalled a classmate, John Colwell, but he was dead serious about the essential spirit of the Naval Academy. The 1931 Luck Bag begins with a gold-embossed quotation in large print from John Paul Jones. "I do not wish to have command of any ship that does not sail fast, for I intend to go in harm's way." Judging from his later words and deeds, Evans was inspired by the example of the Revolutionary War hero, whose body was entombed in a magnificent sarcophagus beneath the Naval Academy chapel, and whose sayings the midshipmen were required to memorize. Evans, like Halsey, wanted to become an aviator. The most daring option offered a newly commissioned ensign. Like Halsey, he lacked good eye-hand coordination. Unlike Halsey, who was a captain with the command of a carrier awaiting him, Evans washed out of flight school. The late 1930s found him in command of a tugboat in San Francisco harbor, but Evans did not complain. Indeed, he appeared to take some ironic pleasure in being underestimated. Among his duties was to serve as a harbor pilot, a job that allowed him to take the conn of an aircraft carrier, USS Saratoga, as she navigated the tidal rips and traffic of San Francisco Bay. Evans had been wearing ordinary blue denim work clothes without officers' insignia, and when he showed up that night at the officers' club in dress blues, he saw the officers from the Saratoga eyeing him with puzzlement. "Doesn't that guy look familiar?" one asked, unable to quite believe the dark-skinned guy in denim that afternoon had been a naval officer. In later years, telling that story to one of his junior officers, Evans seemed more bemused than bitter. But the incident had stuck with him, a reminder that the best revenge against prejudice was skill. In 1941, Evans finally won a place on a warship as executive officer on an aging four-piper destroyer on the China Station, an obsolete ship sailing in a backwater. Evans's ship, USS Alden, was near Singapore in early December when word came of the Pearl Harbor attack. The ship, along with 3 other four-pipers, was ordered to refuel in Singapore and head to sea to help defend 2 British warships in anticipation of an air attack at dawn. The captain's report of another destroyer, USS Edwards, describes a slightly comical departure scene. Problems with fueling delayed the squadron from getting underway, and the ship's men tripped over one another clearing the decks for action. "We made a good many mistakes in stripping the ship so hurriedly," reported the captain of the Edwards. "We dumped all our gasoline. We got rid of most of our paint." The captain did intervene to stop the men from tossing overboard the loudspeaker for our movie machine and record player, because he reasoned the use of phonograph records would do much to help the men pass the time later in the war. The destroyers of the 57th Division finally arrived on station off the coast of Singapore a few hours after HMS Prince of Wales and Repulse had been sunk by Japanese planes. Evans's first taste of war was the smell of fuel oil on a windless Pacific night. All that was left of the mighty British battleship and battlecruiser was some charred flotsam. British destroyers had picked up roughly 2,000 survivors, while another 900 men had died. The Alden joined a combined fleet of British, American and Dutch warships, described by one naval history as elderly and decrepit, to try to stop or slow the Japanese onslaught into the Dutch East Indies in the winter of 1942. The Alden was sailing under the overall command of a Dutch admiral, Karel Doorman of the Royal Netherlands Navy, when the motley fleet encountered a Japanese strike force advancing on Java in late February. The men of the Allied fleet were exhausted from weeks of false alarms. All dolphin trails were torpedo tracks. Every masthead sighting was an enemy ship. Morale was very low. The Japanese had better ships and air cover. When Admiral Doorman announced that the Allies had the possibility of fighter protection, laughter could be heard on ship bridges around the fleet. In the wardroom of the Alden, the shortwave could pick up a female announcer on Radio Tokyo, taunting them in English. "Poor American boys. Your ships are swiftly being sunk. You haven't a chance. Why die to defend foreign soil which never belonged to the Dutch or British in the first place? Go home, before the slackers steal your wives and girls." In the late afternoon of February 27th, the American, British, Dutch, Australian battle fleet, arrayed in ragged formation, confronted the Japanese strike force. Though destroyers are normally in the vanguard in a fleet action to loose their torpedoes, the 4 old American destroyers huffed along in the rear. Aboard the Alden, confusion reigned. Dorman's orders had to be translated from Dutch to English aboard an American cruiser, the Houston, and then transmitted to the destroyers by short-range radio. Apparently, the transmitter was broken or blocked, because at first the Alden received no orders and just played follow the leader. Lieutenant Evans was standing on the bridge with his captain, Commander Lewis Coley, when they saw a British destroyer up ahead virtually vanish in a rain of Japanese shells. The ship sank in less than half a minute. The sun was setting when the order, relayed by a blinker light, finally got through to Alden: destroyers counterattack. The aging 4 Pipers wheeled to face the enemy and steamed past the Allied cruisers toward the Japanese ships, whose guns could be seen flashing on the dusky horizon. But from the signal lamp on the Houston came another order from Admiral Dorman, presumably translated from the original Dutch: cancel counterattack. Aboard the lead destroyer, USS Edwards, the squadron commander, T.H. Binford, was puzzled. Was he reading Dorman's signals right? And then, rapid-fire, a third order: cover my retreat. But destroyer attack was the normal method of covering a retreat. With no time for crossword puzzles, records a U.S. Naval Institute history of destroyer operations, Commander Binford ordered a strike at the oncoming enemy. On the American destroyers came, trying to close within 10,000 yards before the Japanese cruisers could blow them out of the water. On the bridge, Evans and the officers of the Alden watched in wonder as Japanese shells splashed around them. The waterspouts were brightly coloured red, green, yellow. The Japanese had put dye in their shells to help them track the accuracy of each gun. The Technicolor display added an element of unreality to a scene that was already surreal. The World War I vintage destroyers had laboured, straining every rivet just to keep up with their own fleet at 28 knots. Now they were leading the attack. A man on the bridge of the Alden was heard to remark, "I always knew these old 4 Pipers would have to go in and save the day." The laughter eased the tension for the moment. The torpedo attack was a failure. All 40 torpedoes launched by the squadron either missed their targets or failed to explode. American torpedoes were notorious for malfunctioning early in the war. "Follow me," signalled Admiral Dorman, and the destroyers turned to follow the main fleet into the night, unsure where they were going, their aged boilers barely able to sustain enough steam. Finally, Commander Binford, on his own initiative, broke off from the engagement. Realizing that I had no more torpedoes and that further contact with the enemy would be useless, since my speed and gunpowder were less than anything I would encounter, I retired, the squadron commander later wrote. The old greyhounds panted into harbour, records the Naval Institute history. But the sea battle, the first fleet action of the Pacific War, kept raging through the night. It was a disaster for the Allied forces, with 3 light cruisers and 3 destroyers sunk and 1 heavy cruiser damaged. The Japanese had a single destroyer damaged. However giddy that headlong if futile charge at sunset, Evans felt that he had participated in a fiasco. He was ashamed that the American destroyers had withdrawn from the battle, skulking into port while other ships in the Allied fleet were still taking fire at sea. It was doubly galling that one of the destroyers in the squadron was named the John Paul Jones, after Evans's hero. That night on the Java Sea, he would later tell his subordinates, he formed a vow never to retreat from harm's way. It was known as the victory disease. Japan's victories seemed so overwhelming, so easy, so divinely inspired, that the Japanese people became overconfident. They felt that nothing could stand in the way of the march toward global dominance by the leading race Hakoichiu, the 8 corners of the world under one roof. Despite his misgivings about the war, Admiral Ugaki was not immune. On February 24, 1942, when Admiral Halsey ran another one of his hit-and-run raids on Wake Island, sinking only a small patrol craft, Ugaki mockingly wrote, "For the Americans, today is called Washington's birthday, and President Roosevelt was going to make a fireside talk. They had to do something, or the existence of the United States Navy would have been doubted." In late February, the Japanese were still celebrating the collapse of the British Army at Singapore earlier that month. In Tokyo, wearing the full dress uniform of a general, the Emperor had appeared on his white horse, Snow White, on a bridge at the Imperial Palace. In early March, Rangoon and the Dutch East Indies fell before the rising sun, prompting a huge victory celebration in Tokyo. The popular euphoria made Ugaki uneasy. Suppose, he wrote in his diary, there was an American air raid over the head of the rejoicing multitude. On April 18th came the raid Ugaki feared. Immediately after Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt had begun agitating for a way to strike back at the Japanese, and the Navy had come up with an audacious scheme to attack Tokyo. Carriers would transport army bombers, B-25s so large they could barely fly off a carrier deck to within striking range of Japan. The top-secret plan called for a bold commander to get them there, and naturally Nimitz had called on Halsey. Worrying about Japanese submarines every mile of the way, Halsey had sailed the Enterprise and the carrier Hornet across the Pacific to within 700 miles of Japan. There, in a 40-knot gale, the task force encountered a Japanese picket ship and sank it, but not before the Japanese flashed a radio warning to Tokyo. Rescued from the sea, a Japanese sailor reported that he had informed his captain of 2 beautiful Japanese carriers passing by. The captain ran on deck and returned muttering, "Yes, they are beautiful, but they are not ours." Then he went to his cabin and shot himself. The carriers were in range of Tokyo, but only barely. After hastily lugging extra jerrycans of gasoline aboard their planes, Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle and his men took off, their B-25s groaning and struggling off the Hornet's pitching deck. On the bridge of the Enterprise, Halsey knew, as he later wrote, that he was witnessing one of the most courageous deeds in military history. As the B-25s passed the Japanese coast, children and old men on bicycles waved cheerfully. They had never seen an American plane and could not imagine an attack on the homeland. Soon the bombers were over Tokyo. 4 bombers hit other cities, where they encountered no resistance from disbelieving defenders. The bomb damage was light, and the brave flyers under General Doolittle, their planes out of fuel, had to crash land in China. Captured by Japanese soldiers, 3 of them were tied to white crosses and executed. Amazingly, 67 pilots and crewmen were rescued by the Chinese and smuggled out of Japanese-occupied territory. The Japanese retaliated by killing 250,000 Chinese civilians. Suspected of helping the Americans, one woman was wrapped in a kerosene-soaked blanket. At gunpoint, her husband was forced to set her afire. The Japanese press joked that the American bombing of Tokyo was not a Doolittle but a do-nothing attack. But to Ugaki, this was just bluster. He was feeling shaken. His Etajima roommate had been killed by American planes on one of Halsey's raids. "Our homeland has been air-raided and we missed the enemy without firing a shot at him," wrote Ugaki on April 20th. "This is exceedingly regrettable." His regret paled beside Admiral Yamamoto's. The Commander-in-Chief's steward later said that he had never seen his boss look so wan or depressed. For a day, Yamamoto retired to his cabin. Judging from the letters he wrote at the time, fretting about the vulnerability of Japan's paper and wood cities, he was imagining what Japanese cities would look like if the Americans ever came close enough to stage full-scale bombing attacks. The Japanese war plans had always called for the decisive battle close to home waters, after wearing down the American fleet as it crossed the Pacific. But the Americans were sending out quick-hit raiders and then fleeing. Yamamoto was looking for a way to lure out the entire American fleet and defeat it once and for all before American industrial power could crank out more and more powerful warships. He wanted to follow up a naval victory by seizing the Hawaiian Islands and, in effect, holding them hostage to win a favorable peace settlement. In his conference room aboard the Nagato, Yamamoto had been running tabletop war games for the decisive battle against the American fleet. The Japanese fleet would engage the Americans near a mid-Pacific island called Midway. The children's hour, Yamamoto wrote a friend, was over. Now comes the adults' hour. The Enterprise and the Hornet slipped back into Pearl Harbor from the Doolittle mission on April 25th. This time there were no cheers or marching bands. The raid on Tokyo had been staged in secret. President Roosevelt winkingly told reporters that the American bombers had come from Shangri-La. On the bridge of the Big E, Admiral Halsey looked grim-faced and exhausted. He was sick. He had developed an itching rash over much of his body, and no amount of creams or powders or oatmeal baths seemed to cure it. He was sleeping only fitfully. His weight had dropped by 20 pounds, from 185 to 165. Halsey was under enormous stress. The secret voyage across the Pacific had taken a toll. Halsey made a brisk joke of his hasty retreats from enemy waters. His staff nicknamed him Haul Ass Halsey. But the tension was starting to show. Halsey had no embracing and comforting family to return to. His wife, Fan, was in Wilmington, Delaware, with their daughter. Even if she had remained in Honolulu, she would not have offered much solace. She was mentally unstable, suffering from increasingly severe manic depression. Frances Grandy had been a vivacious Southern debutante when Halsey had first courted her. Actually, she had courted him by throwing her hand muff at a handsome, if apparently over-serious, young ensign as he drilled some sailors on a dock in Norfolk, Virginia. The muff knocked off Halsey's hat and drew his attention to a blonde-haired young woman with a mischievous smile. Halsey soon learned that his flirtatious teaser came from a good Virginia family. She was the sister of one of his St. Anthony Hall brothers and the niece of a Confederate naval officer. He fell in love and asked for her hand. At first, Fan was lively and fun, but her mood swings became ever more severe. At dinner with other officers, she might be witty or talk too much, or turn on Halsey and run him down in front of his fellow officers. Halsey took it all in good spirits, or tried to, but he was pretending. Fan's sickness had become noticeable to other officers when Halsey was stationed at Pensacola during his flight training in 1937. For all his joking about winning the Flying Jackass, Halsey had struggled in flight school. His weight had dropped from a somewhat pudgy 200 pounds to a very lean 155, which he blamed on poor mess hall food, though nerves were the more likely cause. Fan was not particularly sympathetic. She grabbed the loose skin under his chin and said, "What are these wattles? You look like a sick turkey buzzard." Halsey felt that he could not really trust his wife, who referred to him loudly as an old fool, not necessarily affectionately. In late November 1941, as he was about to sail for Wake Island to deliver the planes to the Marine outpost there, he had confided to Fan that war might be close. She had become agitated and caused a scene in the dining room of the Halekulani Hotel on Waikiki, where Halsey and other officers were living. Halsey was relieved when she was packed off with other dependents and headed to their daughter's home on the mainland. But, from cryptic comments he made from time to time, and from the look on his face when he mentioned Fan, he worried about her. He was not the sort to talk much about his family life. He had no outlet or release, other than a bottle of scotch when he was in port. May Halsey hid his skin rash from Admiral Nimitz as long as he could. But when the Enterprise returned from a cruise in the South Pacific in May, Nimitz was shocked by the sight of Halsey, gaunt and hollow-eyed, and covered with blisters. Halsey could not stop himself from scratching. Nimitz ordered his fighting admiral to report to the hospital. Halsey was lying under a single sheet, naked and swathed with ointments, when his successor, Admiral Raymond Spruance, led the American carriers, the Enterprise and the Hornet, to one of the greatest victories in the history of the U.S. Navy. Breaking pieces of the Japanese code, the Americans got the jump on Admiral Yamamoto's fleet off of Midway. Catching the Japanese as they were refueling and rearming planes, American dive bombers sank the four main carriers of the Japanese striking force. The defeat spelled the end of Yamamoto's efforts to sink the U.S. Navy before America became too strong for Japan. From now on, Japan would be on the defensive, slowly retreating across the Pacific vastness to the home islands and Armageddon. The American victory at Midway in June 1942 was instantly regarded as a turning point in the Pacific War. Halsey was bitterly disappointed to miss it. His rash worsened in the Pearl Harbor hospital. Halsey blamed a fine coral dust from a construction site a half-mile away, but his skin condition, described on the medical charts as generalized allergic dermatitis, was probably psychosomatic. Yamamoto's agony was far greater. His biographer describes him after the Battle of Midway, his face greasy with sweat from severe abdominal pains, retiring to his private cabin, declaring that it was all his responsibility. Halsey was flown back to the States to get special attention at a hospital outside Richmond, Virginia. Informed that he would receive allergy tests to determine the cause of his illness, Halsey declared, "Make sure the first test is a case of Scotch whiskey." What he needed was rest. By the end of August, after briefly seeing his family, he was back to his old self. Travelling to Annapolis to appear before the brigade of midshipmen in their dress whites, Halsey, looking feisty and ready for war in his baggy khakis, declared, Missing the Battle of Midway has been the greatest disappointment of my life, but I'm going back to the Pacific, where I intend personally to have a crack at those yellow-bellied sons of bitches and their carriers. At noon on September 21st, 1942, the aircraft carrier Saratoga limped into Pearl Harbor after taking a torpedo in the South Pacific. Nimitz came aboard and took the microphone aboard the flight deck to address the ship's weary men. "Boys, I've got a surprise for you. Bill Halsey's back." Halsey stepped forward and the men on deck erupted. Halsey's eyes filled with tears. Nimitz was watching Halsey closely. To steady his own nerves, the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet had set up a horseshoe pit behind his quarters at Pearl Harbor, as well as a shooting range. That evening, Nimitz took Halsey out on the range and watched as Halsey plinked away at targets set out by the Filipino houseboy. Nimitz wanted to see if Halsey's hand was steady. Halsey must have shot straight that night, because Nimitz made a momentous decision. The Navy and Marines were locked in the first great battle of the long, slow, island-hopping campaign of the Pacific. After the hit-and-run raids on small mid-Pacific islands, the Navy had begun to try to seize Japanese-held islands in the South Pacific as stepping stones on the long road to Tokyo. The first was Guadalcanal, not a canal, but rather a hilly jungle island. Guadalcanal was located in the Solomon Islands, in the Bismarck Archipelago northeast of Australia. First discovered in 1568 by Spanish explorers looking for King Solomon's fabled gold mines, it had become a British possession, but not a very valuable one. Some hardy colonialists harvested coconuts, but the island was a dank and eerie place, pestilential and fetid. It was, however, strategically important. The Japanese were building an airfield there, a base to strike south against Australia and New Zealand. The Americans wanted to capture the airfield. With an airbase at Guadalcanal, the Americans could take a stand against the Japanese and turn the tide in the Pacific, pushing north. American troops had landed on Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942, and with only minor casualties, seized the nearly completed Japanese airfield, which they renamed Henderson Field after a Marine bomber commander lost at Midway. But the Japanese counterattacked by land, sea, and air. The fight was not going well for the green American troops. The Japanese Navy had outfoxed the Americans in a night battle off Savo Island in September, sinking 4 heavy cruisers in 8 minutes, and the Marines were struggling in jungle combat against die-hard Japanese forces. Nimitz had visited the overall commander in the South Pacific, Admiral Robert Gormley, and found him weary and indecisive, his staff beset with defeatism. Nimitz's answer was Halsey. On October 18th, when Halsey received his orders to replace Admiral Gormley as COMSOPAC Commander South Pacific, he exclaimed, "Jesus Christ and General Jackson, this is the hottest potato they ever handed me." Halsey felt badly about Gormley, with whom he had played football at Annapolis. He also wanted to be prowling the bridge of a warship, not sitting at a desk mediating inter-service disputes and wrestling with logistics. But while Nimitz knew that Halsey did not wish to be a detail man, fussiness had been part of Gormley's problems. Nimitz wanted a fighter who would rally the troops. The whole nation was watching Guadalcanal. The great campaigns against the Germans in Africa and Europe still awaited. A remote island in the South Pacific was providing the first test of American troops on the offensive, the first step toward regaining lost ground. Anyone reading a newspaper or watching a newsreel knew about the Tokyo Express, the nightly convoys of Japanese destroyers bringing fresh men and supplies to the Japanese garrison, as well as Iron Bottom Sound, the waters off Guadalcanal so named because of the many ships sunk there. Guadalcanal, the New York Times editorialized on October 16th, just before Halsey took over, "The name will not die out of the memories of this generation. It will endure in honor." The editorial sounded ominously like an elegy, noted the leading historian of Guadalcanal, Richard Frank. In truth, the American Marines holding the line on Guadalcanal were rattled by an enemy that cried, "Babe Ruth, eat shit," before making dead-of-the-night bayonet charges. Exhausted, frightened pilots back from their missions were crawling under the wings of their planes to sob. Marine Air Commander General Roy Geiger had to kick them, literally kick them, back into their cockpits, wrote Halsey in his memoir, not without a certain admiration, though his own leadership style was far more avuncular and jocular. Halsey's reputation for rallying the troops was well known in the Pacific, and the mere announcement of his appointment to replace Gormley seems to have had an electric effect. Then we got the news. The old man had been made Comsopac, recalled an air combat intelligence officer based at the Marines' besieged Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. 1 minute we were too limp with malaria to crawl out of our foxholes. The next we were running around whooping like kids. Halsey arrived aboard Gormley's flagship, the Argonne, anchored in port at Noumea on New Caledonia, a French-colonized island 700 miles to the south of Guadalcanal, and set about making the sort of small changes that sent signals. His decision to dispense with the black neckties worn by naval officers seems minor. The army had already abandoned theirs. But as Frank noted, to his command, it viscerally evoked the image of a brawler stripping for action. More bluntly, Halsey ordered painted on a large billboard at the naval base at Tulagi, across Iron Bottom Sound, his crude command to kill Japanese, kill more Japanese. Pretty soon, sailors and Marines were penciling the exhortation on the walls of latrines. Gormley had lived and worked aboard the Argonne in cramped, stifling quarters. Halsey had no diplomatic inhibitions. He simply requisitioned the French consul's house on an airy hilltop and built a couple of Quonset huts for staff officers, promptly dubbed Wiki-Wacky Lodge. Halsey disapproved of the French consul's furniture, Japanese-made seats so low to the ground that we sat on our necks. When his Filipino steward dropped some of the consul's china, Halsey bellowed, "To hell with it! It's Japanese!" Halsey would brook no retreat, but he tried to give commanders heart and to smooth over inter-service rivalries by placing a bottle of scotch on the table. On October 23rd, the new Comsopac met with General A. Archer Vandergrift, commanding the 1st Marine Division. Glass empty, fingers drumming the desk, Halsey asked Vandergrift if the Marines could hold Guadalcanal. "I can hold, but I've got to have more active support than I've been getting." Halsey replied, "You go on back there, Vandergrift. I promise you everything I've got." Halsey knew that he also had a sea battle brewing. By piecing together radio traffic analysis and search plane sightings, naval intelligence deciphered that Yamamoto was sending a carrier force south. Halsey hoped for another Midway. He sent a cable to Admiral Thomas Kincaid, in command of the carrier task force that included Enterprise and Hornet. Attack, repeat attack. But Kincaid, at least in Halsey's view, fatally hesitated. Kincaid would later blame poor communications, an excuse that would resonate 2 years later when the two men were miscommunicating at Leyte Gulf. But in any case, the Americans allowed the Japanese to get the jump. In a confused battle off the Santa Cruz Islands, the Hornet was sunk and the Enterprise badly damaged, leaving Halsey temporarily without any aircraft carriers to fight the Japanese. Halsey quietly moved to have Kincaid relieved from Carrier Task Command, an insult that Kincaid would not forget. In a letter to Nimitz on October 31st, Halsey took ultimate responsibility for the Navy's poor showing at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. But he made some mild excuses and tried to put on his bravest front. "As you may well imagine, I was completely taken aback when I received your orders to relieve Gormley on my arrival here. I took over a strange job with a strange staff, and I had to begin throwing punches almost immediately. As a consequence, quick decisions had to be made. Since the action off of Santa Cruz, I have about reached the conclusion that the yellow bastards have been playing us for suckers." He vowed better strategies to, as he indelicately put it, secure more monkey meat. Unlike Gormley, Halsey went to the front to visit the troops. His visit was like a wonderful breath of fresh air, General Vandergrift said later. Comsopac bounced around in a jeep with the Marine commander and stomped around in the mud. He was, as usual, dressed in unadorned khakis, almost indistinguishable from a PFC's private first class, recalled his flag lieutenant, who urged him to stand by his jeep and wave to the troops. In a rare moment of restraint, Halsey declined, muttering, "It smells of exhibitionism. To hell with it." That night he lay sleepless in Vandergrift's shack, listening to nearby artillery barrages. Halsey returned to Noumea to be greeted with more ominous intelligence. The Japanese were mounting another major push from the sea. Halsey committed all the naval strength he had the battered Big E, 2 battleships, and various cruisers and destroyers to turning it back. He was full of trepidation as he sat in his cabin aboard the Argonne reading a trashy magazine, inhaling coffee and cigarettes, and awaiting word of the outcome. He knew he was violating Holy Writ at the Naval Academy by again sending capital ships into shallow, confined waters where they could not maneuver easily. But he had exposed his carrier and gotten away with it at Wattier, and he prayed that Nelsonic bravura would sustain him again. His bet paid off. The Japanese were routed, their reinforcements destroyed or turned away. At what became known as the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal on November 12th to 15th, the Japanese lost 2 battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, 3 destroyers, and 10 troop transports. The Americans lost 2 light cruisers and 7 destroyers. "We've got the bastards licked," Halsey triumphantly declared to his staff. "To all ships," Halsey messaged, like a Roman proconsul to his centurions. "Magnificently done X to the glorious dead. Hail heroes, rest with God." That month, Halsey won an extra star, making him a full 4-star admiral. He sent his 2 3-star collar bars to the wives of Admirals Dan Callahan and Norman Scott, who were killed off Guadalcanal while carrying out Halsey's "damn the torpedoes" credo. Halsey wanted only officers like them, who would attack. After the Japanese torpedoed 4 cruisers at the Battle of Tassafaronga on November 30th, Halsey censured a destroyer captain for sailing away after launching his torpedoes. "The commander should have kept coming with guns blazing," Halsey decreed. Halsey's favourite destroyer captain, his model fighting man, was Arleigh Burke, commander of Task Force 23, the Gallant Squadron. Burke's standing orders were, destroyers to attack on enemy contact without orders from the task force commander. Here was a destroyer man after Halsey's heart. Burke instructed his captains, "If you make a mistake, for Pete's sake, make it on the radical side." Burke further endeared himself to Halsey by his quick thinking when Halsey questioned why Burke had detached a destroyer to Australia without permission from Comsopac. "Admiral," Burke explained, "we needed beer and whiskey." Halsey pretended to ponder this ridiculous excuse for a minute, then replied, "Burke, that's all right, but if you had sent her to Sydney for anything like repairs, I'd have your hide." The health fanatic Burke, who gobbled raw carrots to improve his vision for night battle, played the role of hard-drinking, hard-loving sea dog for Halsey. The symbol of the Gallant Squadron was the cartoon character the Little Beaver, a little Indian boy, aiming a bow and arrow. Halsey affectionately teased his favourite destroyer man as 31-knot Burke, not because, as popularly assumed, Burke was always full speed ahead, but rather because a faulty boiler slowed his Fletcher-class destroyer from 35 to 31 knots. Burke revered Halsey, although his veneration would be severely shaken at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Halsey had turned the tide at Guadalcanal. From now on, the Japanese were on the defensive, in land battles as well as at sea. He had become a household name. His picture graced the cover of Time. Halsey of the South Pacific, the magazine headlined, "When an attacker is attacked." Under Halsey, American forces hit hard, hit fast, hit often. Newsmen flocked to Comsopac, confident of a good quote. He did not disappoint. Touring New Zealand on New Year's Eve, he predicted that the Americans would be in Tokyo by the end of 1943 and made various unprintable aspersions, caught by the censors, against the Emperor and Prime Minister Hideki Tojo. His prediction of a fast end to the war did not play well in Washington. The production leaders at home put up a bellow that I could hear in Noumea. They were afraid that Labour would take my word as gospel and quit their war jobs, Halsey later marvelled. The draft authorities also complained, as did a lot of other officials. They accused me of everything from recklessness to drunkenness. Tokyo Rose, the American voice who liked to taunt American GLs over Japanese radio, began listing the tortures that would be inflicted on Halsey when he was captured. Even Halsey's chums chimed in. When Halsey returned to Noumea, he found a couple of fellow admirals pretending to stir a giant pot of boiling oil, they cheerfully proclaimed. Halsey never backed off his virulence toward the Japanese. In one private letter, he suggested that after the war, he would advocate for the yellow bellies that are left emasculation for the males and spaying for the females. Such wildly racist, if not genocidal remarks are cringe-worthy, but they were not so uncommon at the time. And not just aimed at the Japanese. FDR mused aloud to his advisers about castrating the German male population to prevent Germany from starting another war. A popular song on American radio at the time was, "We're going to have to slap the dirty little Japanese," and the most popular float at a day-long parade in New York in 1942, entitled "Tokyo, We Are Coming," showed bombs dropping on a frantic pack of yellow rats. Glowering for the cameras, growling about yellow-bellied bastards, Halsey was, especially during the first anxious months of the war, a reassuring figure to many Americans. He was not a model of war college professionalism, to be sure, and the top brass in Washington and later historians would regard some of his moves in the fall of 1942, such as sending 2 carriers to take on the combined fleet at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, as reckless. Still, he was more than an inspirational figure. His leadership at Guadalcanal was resourceful, lucky, bold, and, most important, successful at turning around a near disaster. For all his spouting off, and despite enough nervous energy to cover him in rashes, Halsey was an instinctive leader who knew how to seize opportunity and get the best out of his men. The British Royal Navy's liaison officer, Commander Harold Hopkins, visited Halsey one day at his quarters in Noumea. Halsey, dressed in shorts, no socks, and a khaki shirt without insignia, sat on the veranda offering drinks and swatting at mosquitoes as he jawed and joked. I remember thinking that he might well have been a parson, a jolly one, an old-time farmer, or Long John Silver, said the British visitor. But when I left him and thought of what he had said, I realized that I had been listening to one of the great admirals of the war. 4 days before Halsey arrived in the South Pacific to take over from the beleaguered Admiral Gormley in October 1942, the Japanese staged a raid that severely jarred the Marines' tenuous grip on Henderson Field and demoralized the troops caught in the bombardment. Under cover of darkness, 2 Japanese battleships, the Congo and Haruna, had sailed into range, 10 miles off the Guadalcanal coast, and unleashed a terrific bombardment of high-caliber shells. A shell from the battleship's 14-inch gun was almost as long as a man and packed 1,400 pounds of explosives. At Henderson Field, planes erupted into flames and fuel dumps went off in fiery cataclysms as Marines prayed in their foxholes. If the ships had been able to keep up the bombardment, they might have dealt the Marines' Air Force a fatal blow. But the battleship commander in charge of the raid felt compelled to withdraw. The commander's name was Admiral Kurita. Classically educated and civilized, and a great seaman to boot, Kurita was a living reproach to Halsey's racial jibes about monkeys. Kurita was, as much as Halsey, the product of a great naval tradition, but he was perhaps a little gun-shy, at least in comparison to some of his more death-defying comrades in arms. Admiral Kurita appeared to be a modest, amiable man whose innocuous presence concealed a strong character, though not one particularly suited to the brutal demands of total war. A formal portrait of Kurita, taken in 1944, shows a rather severe figure with a shaved head. It is a misleading picture. Kurita was suffering from dengue fever when the photograph was taken, his daughter Shigeko Terada recalled, and his face had been worn by defeat. Kurita was a gentleman, quiet but kindly. Unlike the fierce Ugaki, he smiled easily. Like Ugaki, he was scholarly and had graduated high in his class, 18th of 149 students at Etajima. Unlike Ugaki, he had no interest in administration, staff work, or naval politics. Top Etajima graduates tended to spend a great deal of time ashore at war colleges and on the general staff. Kurita, by contrast, had spent nearly his entire career at sea, specializing in torpedo attack aboard destroyers and cruisers. During the war, he had been continuously at sea except for 2 weeks when he was detached to the general staff. Kurita had long subscribed to the view that battleships, like men, should be preserved, not wasted. In this respect, Kurita was well within the mainstream of the Imperial Japanese Navy. While some commanders wanted to throw ships and men at the enemy, more and especially more senior admirals wished to preserve what was known as the fleet in being. According to this school of thought, mighty ships like the Yamato and Musashi were national icons, quasi-religious symbols as well as weapons of destruction and strategic deterrence. They were to be treasured, like relics, never shattered, or, it sometimes seemed, even scratched. In time, even the emperor would lose patience with the Navy's reluctance to expose sacred battleships to the risk of being sunk. This cautious streak in many Imperial Japanese Navy commanders conflicted with their oft-expressed longing for decisive battle and honorable death. IJN officers lived with contradictions that required tortuous rationalizations. The confusion over naval strategy is illustrative. Like Meiji-era architecture, Japanese naval doctrine was a strange mishmash of East and West, combining elements of the Chinese philosopher Sun Tzu, the emphasis on deception and surprise, ancient Sumeria speeding, circular battle formations, and the disparate philosophies of various European navies. Tactically, in battle, the Japanese seemed to imitate British aggressiveness, Nelson's credo of attacking any enemy in sight. But when it came to overall strategy, the Japanese were influenced by the French and Russian navies, which were essentially defensive. A fleet-in-being man, Kurita had plenty of company, despite all the charging about and cries of banzai by the stereotypical Japanese commander. Passivity was not exactly uncommon in the upper ranks either. Brutalized and humiliated by the unbelievably harsh regimen of Etajima, a man could have his spirit beaten out of him. For many officers, passivity turned to fatalism. For Kurita, on the other hand, it meant avoiding pointless death. Kurita was popular with enlisted men because they knew that he would look out for them, but he was an object of condescension by armchair admirals, who mistook his reticence for meekness and his avoidance of staff duty for dimness. He was regarded as a faithful old sea dog, but not much more. True, he had seen a lot of action, in fact, more than almost any senior officer, and yet his promotions had been widely regarded as more a matter of seniority than talent. The mean, unfair joke about Kurita was that he was a hiru andon, a lantern in daytime, eyed useless. If Kurita was wounded by these slights, he never protested, nor did he comment on the irony that he had been shot at much more than his detractors, who were usually safe in a headquarters bunker in Tokyo while he was dodging American dive bombers in the South Pacific. Kurita was accustomed to cruel irony. In classically contradictory fashion, Kurita had been raised to be both a fighter and a conciliator. The name Takeo means warrior, but his family lineage bred calm contemplation, kindness, and a wariness of foolish conflict. He had been born into a family of great scholars from the Mito prefecture, on the seacoast northeast of Tokyo. His grandfather had been an eminent professor at the University of Tokyo, the author of a famous history of Japan, written in classical Chinese characters. The shoguns who ruled Japan from the 17th into the mid-19th century encouraged the study of Confucianism imported from China. Its principles of loyalty and self-denial were blended into the warrior's code, Bushido. Kurita's father was a scholarly man of independent means who lived in a large house, set behind an enormous gate, on the estate of a great landowner in Mito. Kurita never used terms of endearment like dad or grandpa. He was taught to use the more formal address, teacher-father and teacher-grandfather. Kurita had 7 brothers. My family had a rather strange tradition, recalled Kurita's daughter Shigeko. Because they were scholars, my family used women's names, taken from the classics, for the boys. But Takeo was given a manly name. Without having a weak mind, I am giving the name to be a great warrior, Kurita's grandfather wrote at the boy's birth in 1890. By having a name that means warrior, hope this child will become the one who will live with courage. Takeo was sent off to Etajima in 1905, the year of the Battle of Tsushima, when Japanese reverence for the Navy was reaching a zenith. Like all midshipmen, he memorized the imperial rescript for soldiers and sailors, the collection of precepts which was taught Haik Holy Writ. The rescript emphasized loyalty, duty, and courage, but Kurita appears to have taken to heart passages that were often overlooked or slighted by Etajima's graduates. Those who appreciate true valor should in their daily intercourse set gentleness first and aim to win the love and esteem of others. If you affect valor and act with violence, the world in the end will detest you and look upon you as wild beasts. Of this you should take heed. As a father, his daughter Shigeko recalled, Kurita would point to dusty volumes of Confucian philosophy, written in classical Chinese, and say, "You should read those." He had been required to read them by his own teacher-father. As a boy, Kurita had been steeped in a concept from the Confucian classics called gen, a term that is difficult to translate, but combines kindness, charity, and civility, all aspects of treating people decently. Mito, Kurita's home province, was known for both its emperor worship over the centuries and its ties to the Tokugawa clan, whose shoguns ruled Japan in the 17th and 18th centuries. Reverence for the emperor, the mikado, and loyalty to the shoguns who had effectively usurped the emperor's power became irreconcilable when the Emperor Meiji moved to restore his power in the 19th century. Mito's ruling families at first tried to mediate, then became entangled in messy assassination plots as the Meiji Restoration drove out the old Tokugawa shogunate. Coming from a family of historians, Kurita was undoubtedly aware of the high price of divided loyalty. Kurita himself was not mutapo, the term used to describe the tendency of men from Mito to become riled up when vexed or thwarted. His family as well as his sailors considered him gentle, calm, and empathetic. His daughter Shigeko recalls being slightly awed by the return of the great sea warrior who was so often away from home, but also touched by his thoughtfulness. When his wife was hospitalized while they were stationed in China, and Kurita was called back to Japan, he worried about her becoming lonely and brought her a doll to keep her company. To Westerners, this may not sound like an act of great devotion, but to Kurita's family, it showed sensitivity and unusual consideration. In Japanese, the second meaning for wife, kanaz, is woman in the back room. At home, Kurita lived like a gentleman of an earlier era, dressing in a kimono, practicing archery in the garden. He was not unworldly. He had been to San Francisco on his midshipman's cruise after Itajima. Raised to admire Chinese scholarship and revere the ancient cultivation of the great country of Tang, he did not have the flagrantly racist views of so many Japanese, who sneered at pigtailed chinks. But he was at the same time a true Japanese nationalist. He refused to eat tropical fruit because, he told his family, it lacked Yamato spirit. In the fleet, he was regarded as straightforward, unpretentious, down to earth. He was usually at sea and often in harm's way, or more accurately perhaps, nearly in harm's way. Kurita was a Zelig of sea battle, a witness to or participant in almost every major engagement fought by the Imperial Japanese Navy, though more often at a distance than in the thick of the fight. In the opening days of the war, he had narrowly missed a gunfight with His Majesty's ships Prince of Wales and Repulse. His cruiser arrived on the scene after Japanese planes had torpedoed and sunk the British warships. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, the carrier commander, had been so moved by the destruction of the British ships that he had wept and ordered flowers dropped where they sank. But Kurita had merely smiled and looked pleased. His men had been spared a gun duel with larger, more powerful ships. Kurita was a cruiser division commander at the Battle of the Java Sea and at Midway in 1942. He was criticized for not coming to the aid of 2 damaged cruisers at Midway, and at Java Sea he had the misfortune of operating on the fringes. At Midway he had initially protested against advancing toward the beachhead without air cover. There certainly appears to have been a disinclination to make for the sound of the guns on the part of Kurita and his force, wrote naval scholar H.P. Wilmot, who suggests that Kurita rose up the seniority list by keeping a low profile while more vocal opponents of the war, often able officers, were purged. Many of Kurita's sailors, on the other hand, appreciated that their commander sought to protect them from unnecessary risks. Aboard the battleship Congo at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands that October, he had come close enough to the American carrier Hornet to see her burn. Issuing orders as Combined Fleet Chief of Staff from 700 miles away in the island stronghold of Truk, Admiral Ugaki had wanted Kurita to take the Hornet under tow as a prize of war. Kurita was able to avoid the order. The American carrier, he cabled back, was too far gone. At Guadalcanal, Admiral Yamamoto ordered Kurita to take the Congo and her sister battleship, the Haruna, and sail in close enough to bombard the U.S. Marines' Henderson Field with their giant 14-inch guns. The maneuver was risky. It required the ships to steam back and forth in parade formation while their great guns belched. They would be vulnerable to attack by American PT boats or destroyers from Tulagi. At first, Kurita objected. The potential damage to the American airfield at Guadalcanal, he argued, was not worth the risk of losing 2 Japanese battleships. Under growing pressure from the Emperor to produce results, Yamamoto insisted. Kurita tried a different tack. He asked for machine guns and rifles, tents and shovels for his sailors, so that if the battleships were badly damaged and sinking, the men could run onto the beach and into the jungle. As always, he was thinking about the survival of his crew. The bombardment of Henderson Field came on a tropical night so dark and menacing that a Marine colonel called it a purple night. The battleships used incendiary shells that turned the darkness into an inferno and destroyed scores of planes and almost all the aviation fuel of the dug-in Marines. Though shelled from shore and attacked by PT boats, Kurita's ships escaped unharmed. Henderson Field was badly chewed up and cratered. The Marines' battered fleet of bombers and fighters, the so-called Cactus Air Force, had been 70% destroyed but not annihilated. Some 40 Marines had been killed, and many more had their eardrums blown out. General Vandergrift, the Marine commander, admitted that he had been scared out of his wits. "A man comes close to himself in those times," he later wrote. It had been a terrible night, but not a decisive one. Kurita had carried out his mission with serious damage for U.S. forces. He had been ordered to pound Henderson Field for an hour and a half, but Kurita did not stay that long. After about an hour and 15 minutes, he had turned his ships and headed for safety. He could not see the point in putting his ships and crews at risk for more than a minute longer than necessary.